My name is Philip. I'm 38 years old. I work in risk analytics for a mid-sized financial firm in Chicago. Most people who meet me would describe me the same way. Steady, polite, predictable. The kind of man who shows up 5 minutes early, remembers your coffee order, and never raises his voice in a meeting. In my marriage, I was known as the calm one, the practical one, the one who didn't overreact. If you ask my wife, she would have said I was stable, and she would have meant it as a compliment. But stability can be mistaken for softness. Quiet can be mistaken for blindness. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or cinematic justice. There are no shouting matches here. No secret recordings played at the perfect moment. No last-minute rescues. It's about awareness. It's about the day I found a document that wasn't meant for me to see. A multi-million-dollar life insurance policy taken out in my name, without my knowledge. And it's about what happened in the weeks before and after that discovery, because the policy alone was unsettling. But it wasn't the policy that frightened me. It was the timing. You see, just before I found it, my wife had started changing small things about my daily routine. My meals, my supplements, the brands of groceries she insisted on buying. At first, it looked like care, like health consciousness, like love expressed through nutrition, until it didn't. There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives quietly. It sits with you at the kitchen table. It watches you swallow. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not telling this story to accuse. I'm telling it to document the psychological shift. The moment you realize the person closest to you may not be aligned with your safety. And what do you do when you realize that? This is a story about power, not loud power, but quiet leverage. About what happens when someone assumes you won't notice. About what it means to observe instead of react. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how I was perceived, how small changes began to stack up, how I confirmed what I feared, and why the choice I made changed my life permanently, without destroying anyone else's. There were no villains in capes, just ordinary people making choices. Have you ever had a moment where something small didn't feel right, and you couldn't explain why, but you knew you shouldn't ignore it? Before everything shifted, I was the dependable constant in everyone's story. At work, I was the man who double-checked numbers after everyone else had gone home. The one executives trusted with sensitive projections because I didn't gossip, didn't posture, didn't need credit. My name rarely appeared in company-wide emails, but my spreadsheets shaped decisions that moved millions of dollars. In social settings, I was the one holding the grill at barbecues while louder men debated politics over beers. I wasn't the punchline. I wasn't in the spotlight. I was the reliable infrastructure of the evening. And in my marriage, I was the steady center. My wife, Elena, was vibrant in a way that drew rooms toward her. She had warmth, charisma, and an instinct for aesthetics. She redesigned our home twice in 5 years. Once to refresh the energy, and once because she said she'd outgrown who we were before. I admired that about her. She evolved visibly. I evolved quietly. If she were the visible story, I was the margin notes. People assumed I was easygoing because I didn't interrupt. They assumed I was agreeable because I didn't argue. When you respond to tension with calm, people begin to believe you don't register tension at all. But I did. I just processed it internally. There's a difference between not reacting and not noticing. Most people can't tell the difference. In our marriage, decisions often came wrapped in enthusiasm. I found a better brand. I signed us up for something amazing. Trust me, it's good for us. And I did trust her. Not blindly, just willingly. If something fell off, I would examine the feeling privately before bringing it forward. That was my pattern. I believed in data over instinct, evidence over emotion. Elena used to joke that I'd make a terrible liar because I overanalyzed everything. She would laugh and say, "You think too much, Phil." Maybe I did, but thinking too much keeps you alive in certain professions. It also keeps you quiet in relationships. When friends described us, they'd say we were balanced. She was expressive. I was grounded. She was spontaneous. I was structured. It sounded healthy, complimentary. What they didn't see were the micro moments, the way decisions would be framed as already made, the way my hesitations would be smoothed over with affection, the way my silence was interpreted as consent, not maliciously, just conveniently. If I disagreed with something minor, a purchase, a plan, a social commitment, Elena would tilt her head slightly and say, "You're overthinking it." And I would pause, because sometimes I was, and sometimes that sentence worked. Over time, I became the reasonable one who didn't make a fuss, the husband who supported, the man who adjusted. It wasn't a submission, it was prioritization. Or at least that's what I told myself. You choose your battles, right? You don't escalate small things. You don't create friction over details, except life is built from details. And when details start to shift without your input, something subtle begins to erode. Back then, though, I was still the dependable one, the quiet one, the safe one. To them, I was stable, predictable, unthreatening. What no one realized, not even Elena, was that I remember everything. Dates, phrases, changes in routine. And once I start noticing a pattern, I don't forget it. The first change was so small it would have been embarrassing to question it. It started with breakfast. For years, my routine had been almost mechanical. Oatmeal, blueberries, black coffee, a multivitamin I'd been taking since my early 30s. Nothing exotic, just something my doctor recommended after a routine checkup. One Tuesday morning, I came downstairs and the oatmeal was already prepared. That wasn't unusual. Elena sometimes woke earlier than I did. What was unusual was the color. It looked slightly darker, thicker. I switched brands, she said casually, not looking up from her phone. Organic, fewer additives. I nodded, took a bite. It tasted fine, maybe earthier. I didn't think much of it. 2 days later, she replaced the coffee. "This one's less acidic," she said. "Better for long-term health." Again, reasonable. Then the multivitamin disappeared from the counter. "I ordered something better," she explained. "More comprehensive. The reviews were amazing." That was the first time something inside me paused. Not an alarm, just pause. Because I hadn't mentioned wanting to change anything. I picked up the new bottle. The label was sleek, modern, a brand I didn't recognize. The dosage levels were slightly different from what I was used to. "Did my doctor recommend this?" I asked lightly. She smiled, affectionate, amused. "Phil, you don't need a committee to take vitamins." That sentence lingered longer than it should have. It wasn't dismissive on the surface. It was playful, but it framed my caution as excessive. At work, if someone changed variables in a financial model without documentation, it wasn't called spontaneity. It was called risk exposure. At home, I told myself it was care. Over the next 2 weeks, the changes accumulated. Different olive oil, different protein powders in my smoothies. A new herbal tea she insisted I drink at night for stress. I wasn't stressed, but I drank it because questioning every small shift felt paranoid. And there's a social cost to being the man who scrutinizes everything his wife does out of love. At dinner one evening, she watched me take a sip of the tea. "Do you like it?" she asked. Her tone wasn't casual. It was evaluative. That's when I noticed something else. She was observing my reactions more closely than usual. Not in a nurturing way, in a tracking way. I told myself that was unfair, suspicious thinking without evidence. I work in probabilities. I don't leap to conclusions. Still, that night, I made a small decision. I started carrying my black leather notebook downstairs. Not obviously, it stayed in my bag. But after Elena went to bed, I wrote down the changes. Dates, brands, comments she made. I didn't know why I was documenting it, only that something in me wanted a record. The first small cut doesn't hurt. It's confusion. It's the quiet sensation that the environment has shifted by 1 degree. Not enough to alarm you, but enough that your internal compass recalibrates. Anyone else would have called it thoughtful adjustments. Maybe it was, but patterns don't announce themselves at the beginning. They introduce themselves politely. And I've learned that when something changes without a conversation, it's worth remembering. The strange thing about subtle shifts is how quickly they become the new normal. Within a month, I couldn't have told you exactly when my routine stopped being mine. Breakfast was whatever Elena placed in front of me. Supplements were what she handed me with a small glass of water. Groceries appeared without discussion. Even my preferred brand of sparkling water vanished, replaced with something she described as cleaner. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it effective. When small decisions are made repeatedly on your behalf without resistance, a quiet narrative forms. This is better for you. You don't need to worry about it. And if you're someone who prides yourself on being reasonable, you don't push back without cause. But something else was happening beneath the surface. When I would ask a question, not accusatory, just clarifying, the answer was almost always wrapped in gentle condescension. You're overanalyzing again. It's just food, Phil. Why are you being so intense about something so minor? The pattern wasn't in the words, it was in the framing. My questions became personality flaws. My caution became rigidity. My desire for transparency became evidence that I couldn't relax. And because I've spent most of my life being the calm one, the rational one, I hesitated to contradict that image. There's a quiet social pressure when you're known as the stable one. If you raise concerns, people assume something must be wrong with you, not the situation. One evening, we were at a dinner party with friends. Elena told a light-hearted story about how I still check the expiration date on bottled water. Everyone laughed. I smiled too. It was harmless, technically, but it positioned me as excessive, hyper-vigilant, slightly absurd. Later that night, as we drove home, she reached for my hand. "I hope you didn't mind," she said. "Mind what?" "The joke. You know, I love that you're cautious. It's cute." Cute. That word stayed with me. In professional settings, my caution protected assets. In my marriage, it was adorable. That's how normalization works. It doesn't confront you, it reframes you. Soon I found myself hesitating before asking anything about what I was consuming. I didn't want to become the stereotype she'd lightly constructed. And here's the part that's difficult to admit. I started doubting my own calibration. Maybe I was being rigid. Maybe it really was just food. Maybe being adaptable was healthier than being precise. But adaptability without awareness becomes surrender. Around that time, I noticed something else. Elena began insisting I finish everything she prepared. Not forcefully, just insistently. "You barely touched it. You need the full serving. Trust me. Trust me." Trust is powerful because it asks you to lower your guard voluntarily. And I had no concrete reason not to. There were no arguments, no hostility, no visible resentment. Just a series of small adjustments that positioned me as someone who should accept, not question. One night, after she fell asleep, I opened my notebook again. I reviewed the entries, dates, changes, phrases. Individually, they meant nothing. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Decisions made unilaterally, concerns softened into jokes. My agency subtly reduced under the language of care. Was it malicious? I didn't know, but I knew this. When someone consistently minimizes your awareness, they're shaping your self-perception. And once you begin to question your own instincts, you become easier to manage. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet, quieter than before. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're not just participating in a dynamic. You've been cast in it. Not maliciously, not formally, just gradually. By the end of that second month, I understood the role I had been assigned. I was the stable provider, the low-maintenance husband. The man who didn't require managing because he managed himself. Reliable, useful, predictable, invisible in decision-making, visible in responsibility. When guests came over, Elena handled the aesthetic details, lighting, presentation, and mood. I handled logistics, parking arrangements, wine pairings, cleaning up afterward. If something broke, I fixed it. If a bill arrived, I paid it. If a long-term plan needed structure, I drafted it. And when it came to my own routines, my health, my habits, those were apparently open to revision. There was a subtle asymmetry I hadn't consciously examined before. My responsibilities were non-negotiable. My preferences were flexible. That asymmetry had never bothered me because I believed we were aligned. That whatever adjustments happened were collaborative at their core. But collaboration requires informed consent. And somewhere along the way, information had started flowing in only one direction. I began observing our interactions more clinically. When she proposed something, it came pre-packaged. Research done, decision framed as an improvement. My input was requested only after the momentum was established. It's hard to object once something is already in motion, especially if objecting makes you look unreasonable. One afternoon, I came home early from work. Elena was at the kitchen counter organizing a new set of supplements into labeled containers. When she saw me, there was the briefest flicker in her expression. Not guilt, surprise. "Oh," she said quickly. "I was just streamlining things. It's easier this way." The containers weren't the original bottles. The labels were handwritten. "How did you decide on the dosages?" I asked evenly. She smiled. "I did my research." Research. That word means something specific in my world. It involves sources, peer review, and documented methodology. Here, it meant internet forums and influencer testimonials. I felt the shift again. That internal recalibration. Not anger, recognition. The role I had been assigned didn't include oversight of my own intake. It included compliance. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I had made it easy. When you're known as the calm one, people assume your silence is approval. When you don't contest small decisions, you train others to decide without you. There was no dramatic turning point that day, just clarity. I wasn't being overtly controlled. I was being gently guided into passivity. That evening, as I sat at the dining table with my tea, the herbal one she'd introduced, I didn't drink it immediately. I watched the steam rise, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If the roles were reversed, if I had quietly replaced her supplements, adjusted her meals, dismissed her questions as overthinking, how would that be perceived? The answer came quickly. Controlling, possessive, concerning. But because I was the stable one, the compliant one, it was framed as care. That's when I understood something fundamental. Roles only hold as long as you unconsciously agree to them. And I was beginning to reconsider my agreement. The day something shifted didn't begin dramatically. It was a Thursday, cold, overcast. The kind of Chicago afternoon where the sky looks undecided. I left work early because a client meeting had been rescheduled. I didn't tell Elena, not intentionally, it just didn't occur to me. My schedule had always been predictable. When I walked into the house, it was quiet, no music, no television. I set my bag down and headed toward the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I saw it. The mail had been brought in and placed neatly on the counter. Elena usually sorted it immediately. Bills in one stack, promotions in another. This time it was untouched. And there, half exposed beneath a catalogue, was a large envelope. My name is printed in formal block letters. From a life insurance company I didn't recognize. I felt something tighten. Not panic, just focus. In my profession, you learn not to jump ahead of the evidence. So I didn't open it immediately. I stood still for a moment, registering my own reaction. Why would there be correspondence from an insurer I hadn't contacted? We already had a modest joint policy, something practical aligned with our income and lifestyle. This envelope felt heavier, corporate. I opened it carefully. The document inside wasn't promotional. It was a policy summary, a recently activated life insurance policy. Coverage amount, $4.5 million. Primary beneficiary, Elena Mercer. My signature appeared at the bottom, at least something that looked like it. I sat down at the kitchen table. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a discovery like that. Not loud, not cinematic, just compressed. I reviewed the effective date, 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. That timeline aligned precisely with when the supplement changes began accelerating. When the insistence around meals became firmer. When she began watching me more closely. Correlation is not causation. I repeated that internally. But patterns matter. I studied the signature again. It was close to mine, close enough that most institutions wouldn't question it at a glance. But I signed documents daily, hundreds over the course of a year. I know the pressure pattern of my pen strokes, the rhythm. This one was slightly off, not sloppy, practiced. That's when the shift happened, not in my body. From my perspective, until that moment, the changes in my routine had been ambiguous, irritating at worst. Now they existed inside a new context. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel betrayal in the dramatic sense. I felt clarity. If someone takes out a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy on you without your knowledge, you don't confront them immediately. You verify, you observe, you expand the frame. I placed the document back in the envelope exactly as I found it. Then I did something small but irreversible. I didn't put it back in the pile. I slipped it into my leather notebook and slid the notebook into my bag. When Elena came home an hour later, she kissed me the way she always did. Light, familiar. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," I said. And it was. Because from that moment forward, I wasn't participating in the assigned role anymore. I was assessing risk quietly. There's a difference between silence as a habit and silence as a strategy. For most of my life, I had been quiet because it was efficient, because not every thought needed to be externalized, because stability doesn't require constant declaration. But after that Thursday, my silence changed texture. It became deliberate. That night at dinner, Elena placed a plate in front of me. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, the now familiar herbal tea steeping beside it. I watched her movements more carefully than I ever had before. Not suspiciously, clinically. She seemed normal, relaxed. She asked about work, mentioned a friend's upcoming birthday, laughed at something minor. There was no visible crack. If she knew about the policy, and the beneficiary designation made that clear, she gave no indication that anything had shifted. I took a bite of the salmon, chewed, swallowed, and realized something important. If I confronted her immediately, I would lose informational advantage. Emotion clouds observation. Accusations trigger defensive behavior. Once someone knows you're aware, they adjust. In risk analysis, timing is leverage. So I chose silence. But this time, it wasn't passive. Over the next week, I maintained my routines outwardly. I drank the tea, I took the supplements, I finished the meals. Inwardly, I altered one thing. I reduced intake, not dramatically, just enough. Half the tea instead of full. A partial supplement instead of the entire capsule. I began discreetly discarding small portions when she wasn't looking. I wasn't assuming poisoning. That would be reckless thinking. But I was acknowledging that something about the convergence of events required caution. I also scheduled a quiet appointment with my physician for routine blood work, something I could justify easily given my age and workload. I didn't mention suspicions, I simply requested comprehensive panels. Data first, always data. At home, Elena seemed attentive, more than usual. She'd ask, "Did you finish everything?" Or, "How are you feeling lately?" The questions weren't inherently alarming. Spouses ask those things, but they felt monitored. One evening, she reached across the table and brushed her fingers against my wrist. "You've seemed distant," she said gently. Have I wondered, or have I simply stopped narrating my internal state out loud? "I've just been focused," I replied. She studied me for a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled. Here's what most people misunderstand about restraint. They assume it's a weakness because it lacks volume, but strategic restraint is power delayed. I began reviewing our financial accounts more carefully. Not obsessively, just thoroughly. I checked beneficiary designations on other assets. I confirmed which documents required dual signatures. Nothing else appeared irregular, which meant the insurance policy was an isolated variable. And isolated variables are either mistakes or tests. By the end of that week, my silence was no longer default behavior. It was in observation mode. She believed nothing had changed. That was intentional, because once you realize someone may be operating on a plan you weren't consulted about, your first responsibility isn't confrontation. It's about understanding the full architecture. And architecture reveals itself only when it thinks it's unobserved. If you've ever worked in risk, you learn something early. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks boring. Spreadsheets, calls that sound routine, questions that seem unrelated. What Elena never noticed was that while she was watching my plate, I was mapping the entire structure around us. The first thing I did was verify the policy independently, not through the number listed on the document. That would have created a traceable interaction. Instead, I contacted a colleague I trusted. Daniel worked in compliance for a larger firm that frequently reviewed insurance instruments for institutional clients. I didn't tell him it was personal. I framed it as hypothetical. If someone's signature was replicated on a life insurance application, I asked casually over coffee, what verification steps typically occur? He didn't look up immediately. Depends on the carrier. Some require paramedical exams. Some rely on the digital confirmation. Why? Curiosity, I said, which wasn't a lie. He explained the process in detail. Identity verification, underwriting requirements, and recorded phone confirmations in some cases. Recorded confirmations. That detail stayed with me. I waited 3 days before calling the insurance company directly from my office landline during business hours, framed as an administrative clarification. I provided my identifying information calmly. Yes, the representative confirmed. The policy is active. Can you confirm the method of application? I asked. It was processed through an online broker. Digital signature on file, verification completed via phone. Phone? I repeated evenly. On what number? She provided the last 4 digits. It wasn't my phone number. I thanked her, hung up. That was confirmation, not of intent, but of action. Someone had impersonated me during verification. Back at home, nothing outwardly changed. Elena continued adjusting groceries, continued asking if I'd taken everything, continued shaping small elements of my routine with the tone of someone optimizing a system. But what she never noticed was that I had quietly opened a separate bank account in my name only, not to hide money, but to reallocate future income streams gradually. I updated the beneficiaries on my retirement accounts to a temporary trust structure, something that required no spousal notification under certain thresholds. Legal, clean, controlled. I also met with an attorney, discreetly. I didn't mention suspicion of harm. I didn't accuse. I presented facts. A large insurance policy initiated without my knowledge, signature inconsistencies, and alternate phone verification. The attorney didn't dramatize it. He simply said, "You need documentation, and you need options." Options. That word steadied me. Meanwhile, I kept documenting at home. Brands, timing, conversations, the way she observed me finishing meals. I even purchased identical supplements to the ones she provided and stored them at my office. On days I felt uncertain, I substituted discreetly. My blood work results came back normal. That mattered. It meant whatever this was, if it was anything, it hadn't escalated beyond paperwork and control. But paperwork at that scale isn't casual. $4.5 million isn't a wellness decision. One evening, Elena mentioned casually, "I've been thinking about long-term security lately. You can never be too prepared." I looked at her. Prepared for what? She held my gaze a fraction too long. "Life," she said lightly. What she didn't know was that I had already secured certified copies of the policy. I had requested call logs from the carrier, that I had documented the mismatched phone number. She didn't know that every variable she adjusted at home, I counterbalanced quietly elsewhere. There's a misconception about power. People think it's loud. It's not. Real leverage is built in silence, layered carefully until it can't be ignored. I wasn't building a case to destroy her. I was building a perimeter around myself. And the most important thing she never noticed, I had stopped drinking the tea entirely. I just let the steam rise long enough for it to look consumed. The confirmation didn't come from her. It came from a recording. 2 weeks after my initial call with the insurance carrier, I received what I had formally requested, a copy of the phone verification tied to the activation of the policy. As the insured party, I had the right to obtain documentation connected to my identity. I listened to it alone in my office after hours. The voice on the recording was male, measured, controlled, slightly rushed. It was not mine. The representative on the call confirmed identifying details. My full name, date of birth, and partial social security number. The caller answered correctly, but the cadence was off. The inflection patterns didn't match how I speak. There was a tightness in his tone, as if reading from prepared notes. Then came the confirmation question. "Do you understand that this policy designates your spouse, Elena Mercer, as the primary beneficiary?" "Yes," the voice replied. No hesitation, no inquiry, just acceptance. I replayed that single word 3 times. Yes. It's a strange experience, hearing your life valued at millions of dollars by someone impersonating you. Not dramatic, just dislocating. I didn't feel rage, I felt confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't an administrative error. Someone had orchestrated identity replication, submitted documentation, completed verification. The question was no longer if something was wrong, it was why. That evening, I didn't go home immediately. I sat in my office with the lights off, city skyline reflecting faintly against the windows, and allowed myself to consider possibilities without emotion. Financial desperation, unlikely. Our accounts were stable. Influence from someone else, possible. A long-term exit strategy, more plausible. But even those explanations didn't account for the behavioral shift around my meals. Unless the policy wasn't the beginning, unless it was part of a broader architecture I hadn't yet fully seen. That thought chilled me more than the recording. I drove home later than usual. Elena was already in the kitchen, preparing something. She looked up with an easy smile. You're late. Had to finish something. She nodded, turning back to the stove. I studied her posture, her movements. Nothing outwardly hostile. No nervous energy. If she knew what I knew, she concealed it perfectly. At dinner, she poured the tea again. I lifted the cup, let the steam brush my face, set it down untouched while speaking. She didn't comment. That was new. For weeks, she had monitored consumption. Now, silence, which meant one of two things. Either she believed the pattern was already established and no longer needed reinforcement, or she sensed something had shifted in me. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It didn't trigger confrontation. It created separation. Not physical, cognitive. For the first time in our marriage, I stopped assuming alignment. I began assuming divergence. That subtle shift changes everything. When you no longer presume shared intention, you evaluate every interaction differently. Later that night, while she slept, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and looked at her. Not with accusation, but with distance. How long had this been in motion? Had she acted alone? Did she rationalize it as security, as protection, as something abstract and hypothetical? Or was there an outcome she had quietly calculated? I didn't wake her. I didn't search her phone. I didn't escalate. Because leverage, once revealed, is most powerful when only one person knows it exists. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney again. Not to react, to decide. There's a moment in every crisis where emotion demands action. And then there's the quieter moment that follows, where action must be chosen carefully. Sitting across from my attorney for the second time, I laid everything out with precision. The policy, the forged verification call, the beneficiary designation, the timeline of behavioral shifts at home. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't say, "You're in danger." He said something more useful. You have 3 paths. He outlined them calmly. First, confrontation. Present the evidence. Demand explanation. Potentially trigger defensiveness or denial, and eliminate any advantage of surprise. Second, passive monitoring. Do nothing visible. Continue documenting. Wait for further action. Third, structural separation. Quietly reposition assets, legally document fraud, and create irreversible safeguards before any confrontation occurs. The first option appealed to instinct. The second appealed to patience. The third appealed to clarity. I drove back to the office instead of going home. For the first time since finding the policy, I allowed myself to sit with the emotional weight of it. Not the fear, but the betrayal of process. Marriage, at its core, is shared risk, shared disclosure, shared consent. Someone had removed consent from the equation. And whether her intention was hypothetical or concrete no longer mattered as much as the fact that she had acted unilaterally in a domain that legally required my participation. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a boundary crossed. I opened my notebook and reviewed everything I had documented over the past 2 months. The food adjustments, the monitoring, the framing of my caution as overthinking, the policy activation date, the recorded voice that wasn't mine. Patterns don't beg for attention. They accumulate until ignoring them becomes self-deception. I asked myself a single question. If I confront her now and she denies everything, what changes? If I wait passively and she escalates, what risk increases? If I secure myself first, what do I lose? The answer to the last question was simple. I lose the illusion, but illusions aren't protection. They're anesthesia. By the time I left my office that evening, the decision was made. Not out of anger, out of responsibility. I chose structural separation, not divorce papers delivered in drama, not accusations thrown across a dinner table, but legal and financial repositioning that would make any future maneuver involving my identity impossible without my explicit involvement. Irreversible. That's the word that my attorney had used. Irreversible doesn't mean explosive. It means once done, the architecture cannot return to its previous form. When I walked into the house that night, Elena was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up. "You seem lighter," she said. "Maybe I did, because once you choose clarity, indecision disappears." "I've been thinking," I replied calmly. "About what?" "Long-term structure." She smiled faintly. "That's my responsible husband." Yes, responsible, just not in the way she expected. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. Emotion stepped aside. Structure took over. The first move was simple. I formally disputed the life insurance policy. Not publicly, not aggressively. Through my attorney, we submitted documentation contesting the authenticity of the signature and the verification call. We included handwriting comparison samples and the mismatch in phone records. The insurance company opened an internal investigation. I did not inform Elena. Next, I placed a fraud alert on my credit profile and initiated enhanced identity monitoring. Any new policy, loan, or financial instrument involving my name would now require direct, multi-factor confirmation through channels she could not access. Again, no confrontation, just containment. I also amended my estate planning documents. The temporary trust I had established was converted into a more comprehensive structure. My retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and business-related equity positions were reassigned under controlled beneficiary designations that required notarized acknowledgement for modification. Legally sound, quietly executed. At home, I maintained normalcy. Dinner conversations continued. Social invitations were accepted. I asked about her day. I listened. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer participating from assumption. I was observing from a distance. The herbal tea disappeared from the nightly routine about a week after I stopped drinking it. She didn't comment on its absence. That detail mattered. It meant she noticed patterns, just as I did. One evening, she brought up finances casually. I was thinking, she began, maybe we should review our long-term coverage, just to make sure everything's aligned. I kept my expression neutral. I've already done a review, I said evenly. Her eyes flickered. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Oh, yes, updated some structures, simplified things. She nodded slowly. That's good. There was no argument, no visible tension. But beneath the surface, something recalibrated. In chess, there's a phase where both players realize the board has changed, but neither acknowledges it verbally. That's where we were. At work, I requested a temporary shift in travel schedule. Nothing drastic, just enough to ensure I wasn't predictable in my movements. At home, I installed a small, unobtrusive safe in my office closet. Important documents went inside. Not because I expected escalation, because preparation is quieter than repair. The insurance company contacted me 2 weeks after the dispute was filed. The policy had been flagged for fraudulent verification. It was suspended pending investigation. That was leverage, not because I intended to use it as a weapon, but because the architecture she had constructed was no longer functional. And she didn't know I was the reason. One night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, Elena studied me longer than usual. You've changed, she said softly. Have I? You're harder to read. I considered that. I'm just focused, I replied. That word again. Focused. The truth was simpler. I was no longer available for silent repositioning. And when someone loses quiet access to your structure, they feel it, even if they can't yet explain why. Consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. About a month after I filed the dispute, Elena's mood began to shift. Not dramatically, but subtly. A tightness around her eyes. Longer pauses before responding. More time spent on her phone in another room. One afternoon, I came home to find her at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She gathered them quickly when I walked in. Everything okay? I asked. Just insurance stuff, she replied too quickly. Administrative headache. I nodded, set my bag down, poured a glass of water. The suspension notice would have reached her by then. The carrier had informed all listed parties that the policy was under investigation due to identity verification discrepancies. They wouldn't have accused her directly, but they would have outlined the issue. And that meant she now knew someone had challenged it. What she didn't know was who. Over the next few days, she brought up security more often. Do you think identity theft is getting worse? I read an article about financial fraud. It's terrifying how easy it is. Each comment floated casually into conversation. I responded calmly. It's important to verify everything, I said once. She studied me after that. Longer than usual. The dynamic had shifted. Before, she adjusted variables quietly while I absorbed them. Now, something in the structure resisted. Our financial review meeting, the one she had suggested, became more pointed. I noticed one of our accounts changed beneficiary structure, she said, scrolling through documents. Yes, I replied evenly. Estate planning update. Why didn't we discuss it? We are discussing it now. There was no heat in my voice. That unsettled her more than anger would have. You've never made changes like that without telling me, she said carefully. And you've never initiated major policies without telling me, I answered just as carefully. The air between us thinned. She blinked. What policy? There it was. The moment. Not explosive. Not loud. Just 2 sentences suspended in stillness. I held her gaze. The one activated 3 weeks before my diet changed. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The calculating kind. Her expression shifted. Not to panic, but to containment. I don't know what you're implying, she said. I'm not implying, I replied. I am observing. That was the first time I saw something close to uncertainty in her posture, because uncertainty means loss of control. The next few days were quiet. No more casual jokes about my caution. No more monitoring my plate. No more subtle nudges about supplements. The environment recalibrated. At dinner one night, she didn't cook. She ordered takeout. We ate without commentary. Consequences don't need confrontation to begin. They begin when access changes. When someone realizes the structure they assumed was stable has shifted beyond their reach, and she was beginning to realize that whatever she had built quietly was no longer intact. Once awareness enters a relationship, it doesn't leave quietly. It rearranges the furniture. After our brief exchange about the policy, Elena became careful, not apologetic, not confrontational. Careful. She began asking more neutral questions, offering more transparency about small purchases, mentioning when she moved money between joint accounts. It was subtle, but noticeable. The recalibration had begun. One evening, about 2 weeks after the policy suspension notice, she sat across from me at the dining table. No elaborate meal this time, just something simple. I think we should talk, she said. We are talking, I replied evenly. She exhaled slowly. About whatever you think I did. There it was again, framing. I didn't raise my voice. I don't operate on assumptions, I said. I operate on documentation. She flinched slightly at that word. Documentation. I was advised to increase our long-term coverage, she said carefully. It's not unusual. People do it all the time. People don't typically impersonate their spouses to complete verification calls. The room went very still. She didn't deny it immediately. That was the first honest response. Instead, she looked down at her hands. It wasn't what you think, she said. I didn't interrupt, because once someone begins explaining without being accused directly, they reveal more than they intend to. I just wanted security, she continued. You're the primary earner. If anything happened, I said calmly, the policy would pay out. She swallowed. That's the point. Yes, I replied. That is the point. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just clarity. What about the meals? I asked after a moment. She looked up quickly. What about them? The timing aligned. Her composure fractured briefly, not dramatically, but enough. That's paranoid, she said softly. Is it? I asked. Another long silence. Finally, she said something honest. I didn't think you'd notice. Not that she didn't do it. Not that it was a misunderstanding. She didn't think I'd notice. That sentence told me everything. Whether her intent was hypothetical or something darker almost stopped mattering in that moment. The foundation had shifted from partnership to strategy, and she had underestimated the observer in her own house. I've already taken steps, I said calmly. The policy is suspended, my identity is protected, estate structures are updated. Her eyes widened. What? It's handled. That's when panic entered. Not loud, not frantic, but present. You went behind my back. I held her gaze. No, I said evenly. I secured myself. That was the point of no return. Because once someone realizes you are no longer accessible without consent, the leverage disappears. And leverage once lost cannot be reassembled the same way. She leaned back in her chair. I was trying to plan for the future. And I was protecting mine, I replied. Nothing in the room was broken. No plates shattered. No voices raised. But something was undeniably finished. Trust doesn't collapse from conflict. It collapses from unilateral action. And once you've moved structurally, legally, financially, psychologically, there is no casual way back. It was too late to fix it, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had seen the architecture. And you can't unsee that. The final conversation didn't happen in the kitchen. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in the living room, with daylight filtering through the blinds and the city humming faintly outside. Neutral ground. No plates, no paperwork on the table, just 2 chairs facing each other. Elena sat upright, composed but guarded. I noticed she had chosen her words carefully before even speaking, the way someone does when they understand the outcome will be shaped by tone. I need to understand where we are, she began. We're in a different structure, I replied calmly. That wasn't hostility. It was accurate. She folded her hands. You're treating me like a threat. I'm treating the situation like a risk, I said. There's a difference. She held my gaze. You think I was going to hurt you. It wasn't phrased as a question. I think you made decisions involving my identity and my mortality without my consent, I answered. And I think you assumed I wouldn't examine them. Silence. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was thinking long term. You always think short term risk. I think of future stability. Future stability doesn't require forged verification calls. There was no heat in my voice. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. You're making this sound criminal, she said quietly. I'm describing it factually. Another pause. Then she asked the question that mattered. So what now? I didn't hesitate. I've already separated financial structures. I've documented the policy issue formally, and I'm proceeding with a legal review of our marriage. Her expression didn't collapse. It hardened. You're divorcing me. I'm restructuring my life, I said evenly, just as you restructured my insurance. That landed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown back and forth, no dramatic ultimatums. Just two people acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted beyond repair. I never thought you'd respond like this, she said finally. I know, I replied. That was the quietest truth in the room. She had mistaken composure for passivity, mistaken observation for absence, mistaken my stability as something she could adjust without consequence. I didn't plan anything extreme, she said, almost defensively. It was just security. Security built without transparency is control, I answered. She looked away, and in that moment I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply done participating in a structure that required me to be unaware. We don't need to make this ugly, I said calmly. We can separate cleanly. She nodded slowly, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Quiet doesn't mean powerless, and once quiet power moves, it doesn't need to shout to be final. The divorce wasn't dramatic. There were no courtroom spectacles, no public accusations, no character assassinations whispered through mutual friends. It unfolded the same way I handled everything else. Structured, documented, clean. We divided assets equitably. The suspended insurance policy was formally voided during the investigation. No criminal charges were pursued. The legal system handled the technicalities. But what mattered wasn't the paperwork. It was the recalibration of identity. For most of my adult life, I had been defined by steadiness. The man who absorbed impact without reaction. The one who maintained equilibrium at all costs. There's strength in that, but there's also risk. Because if you never redefine your boundaries, people begin to test them unconsciously. I don't hate Elena. That surprises people when they hear the outline of what happened. They expect anger, bitterness, some lingering need to prove a point. But anger requires emotional attachment to the outcome. And once I understood the architecture, once I saw that she had operated under the assumption that I wouldn't notice, something detached inside me. Not coldness, clarity. I realized I had contributed to the dynamic by being endlessly accommodating, by allowing decisions to slide because they were small, by confusing harmony with alignment. Harmony can be stayed. Alignment requires consent. Today, my routines are my own again. Breakfast is simple. Supplements are ones I've researched personally. My financial structures are transparent, not secretive, just clearly defined. More importantly, my silence has changed again. It's no longer default politeness. It's selective engagement. I ask questions now without softening them to protect someone else's comfort. I don't over-explain my caution. I don't apologize for verifying details. At work, nothing about my role changed. But internally, I feel different. Less available for quiet repositioning. More aware of subtle shifts in dynamics. In friendships, in partnerships, in negotiations. Trust, for me, is no longer assumed. It's built on mutual visibility. And here's what I've learned. You don't need to raise your voice to protect yourself. You don't need revenge to reclaim power. You just need to recognize when the structure around you stops being collaborative and respond before it collapses on top of you. People still describe me as calm. They still say I'm steady, but there's something new beneath that steadiness. Boundaries. Not loud ones, not aggressive ones, just immovable. And once you experience what it feels like to quietly secure your own perimeter, you never confuse silence with weakness again. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you might be expecting a sharper ending, a twist, a punishment, a dramatic downfall. There isn't one. No one went to jail. No one screamed across a courtroom. No secret evidence was revealed in front of an audience. What happened was quieter than that. A boundary was crossed. It was recognized. And it was answered with structure instead of emotion. That's the part people underestimate. We've been conditioned to believe power is loud, that justice requires spectacle, that strength means confrontation. But sometimes strength is simply refusing to remain uninformed. Sometimes justice is refusing to be managed without consent. The moment I discovered that policy, I had a choice. I could react in anger, or I could respond with clarity. Anger might have given me a dramatic scene. Clarity gave me control. Here's the moral I walked away with. If someone assumes you won't notice, they've already rewritten your role in their mind. And if you continue playing that role out of habit, you silently agree to it. Quiet dominance isn't about intimidation. It's about awareness. It's about understanding the architecture of your life, legal, emotional, financial, and making sure no one can restructure it without your participation. Trust is not blind. It's transparent. And the moment transparency disappears, observation must begin. I don't tell this story to make you suspicious of everyone you love. I tell it because small changes matter. Timing matters. Patterns matter. If something feels slightly misaligned, you don't need to explode. You need to pay attention. So I'll leave you with this. If you discovered someone had quietly made a life-altering decision in your name without your knowledge, would you confront them immediately? Or would you secure yourself first? I'd genuinely like to know how you would handle it. Let me know in the comments.